Good morning or good afternoon, everyone, depending on which time zone you're in. My name is Julien Saint-Amand. I'm a representative today for the Habitat Restoration and Conservation Working Group. We're hosting this webinar. I'd like to start with just acknowledging the territory I'm standing on, the traditional territories of the Songhees and Esquimalt peoples, that is in Victoria on Vancouver Island. And I'd like to acknowledge how Indigenous people were taking care of the land for millennia and understood as part of their worldview that people are part of nature, part of the environment, and it showed in the way they were managing the land and wildlife habitat and populations that whatever was good for wildlife was good for people. I'd like also to thank TWS for hosting the webinar and Trisha Fry for organizing everything. And so as I said, the webinar is hosted today by the Habitat Restoration Conservation Group, where roughly our mission is to help members connect and advance any kind of restoration work related to wildlife and wildlife habitat. And if you're interested in joining us, engaging with us, feel free to contact any members. You can visit our webpage on the TWS website. We have also a Facebook group, and we're always looking for engagement. If you have ideas, or if you're very involved in restoration with your work, please feel free to get in touch with us. And I would like to remind you for today that if you have any questions, you can post them in the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen, and there'll be a time at the end for a question period. So today we have John Haufler presenting for us. He was brave to do a full hour today for us, so I admire that, John. And he's currently the executive director for the Ecosystem Management and Research Institute. And John has a bachelor's, master's, and PhD all in wildlife ecology. He was associate and professor at Michigan State for part of his career, and then he became wildlife and ecology program manager for the Boise Cascade Corporation, and then he co-founded the Ecosystem Management Research Institute in 2000, and now he's the executive director. And the Research Institute provides planning assistance and technical support to federal, state, and private initiatives that want to address ecological sustainability, biodiversity, conservation, and all those good things we're passionate about. He's also a past president of the Wildlife Society, and he's currently president of the American Grouse Partnership, I think, and he's based in Montana. And today his talk is titled Habitat Restoration, Addressing Challenges in a Changing World. Very hot topic. So I have the honor to present you John Haufler. You can take it from there, John.
Great. Thank you, Julian. I'm going to go straight to sharing my screen. Hopefully this works. We'll go straight to a slideshow. There we go. So yes, EMRI, as we call the Ecosystem Management Research Institute, is a independent nonprofit institute that focuses on conservation planning at large scales. So it's great to be here sharing some work that we've done and some thoughts on habitat restoration, and particularly how we can do that addressing some of the challenges to habitat restoration today. And I'd like to acknowledge the Habitat Restoration and Conservation Working Group for setting this up. As their website says, they provide a forum for information exchange on restoring wildlife populations and degraded habitat. And they also explore methods for implementing ecosystem management principles that enable whole communities to recover. And that's what I largely want to be focusing on today is how do we do that? So I encourage any of you with interest in these topics to become a member of this Habitat Restoration and Conservation Working Group. Restoration is the process of assisting the recovery of an ecosystem that has been degraded, damaged, or destroyed. Habitat, I consider a characteristic of a species, but it's the historical ecosystems in an area that provided the mix of habitat conditions that supported the habitat requirements for each individual and in total all of our native species. So the question is, how can we maintain and restore landscapes that provide the functional ecosystems needed to support either any one of our species of interest or all of our different species? So in my talk today, I want to do several things. First, I want to take a kind of a very high-level look at how we can characterize terrestrial ecosystems using available information. And the point here is to show you the kinds of information that is out there that can be used to really set up a good restoration program. And some of the examples I'm going to provide, many of them are really applicable in the US. Some of them are US systems, but certainly similar things exist in Canada and in other locations. From that kind of overview, I want to then discuss how we can develop reference conditions for identifying the extent of degradation and how we can set some restoration priorities. And finally, I want to then discuss how we can address some current challenges to restoration, including climate change, novel ecosystems, and invasive species, and leave a bit of time at the end to try to answer any questions that folks may have. So the first thing I think is very important to make sure we're talking the same language. And so the term ecosystem, I'm going to be using it throughout this talk. And I define an ecosystem as a spatially explicit, relatively homogeneous area that includes all interacting organisms and elements of the abiotic environment within its boundaries. And it's typically described in terms of its composition, structure, and function. So with that definition, I'm really talking about in terrestrial systems, going out and being a stand of trees that has a fairly uniform composition and structure, and being able to classify that as an ecosystem and understanding why it's there in terms of disturbance processes and so forth, and how its dynamics work within that landscape. So that's different than how some folks may use more broadly the term ecosystem, but that's how I'll be using it today. So if we're going to classify ecosystems, how do we do that? Well, step one, I think it's very important that we identify and map the specific landscape or landscapes that you're interested in characterizing and classifying ecosystems within. Fortunately, there are a number of tools that are available that make that a fairly easy process. I mentioned 4 of them here. The national hierarchy, I'll go into a little more on that. Natural resources, conservation services, major land resource areas, I'll mention a little more on them. Land fire zones, and then OMERNIC's ecoregions. I won't be saying any more about those, although EPA does use that in some of their mapping of landscapes. So this national hierarchy of ecological units, it's a Bailey's system of hierarchically mapping areas that start with at the domain, which are very big, broad areas, and hierarchically go down to some very small areas around land types and land type phases that sequentially describe and narrow down more and more the kinds of conditions that are in an area. And for defining landscapes, I really like the Bailey's section level that you can see here. Other folks have used it at the province level, as I'll show. Either one can work. The section provides a little more discernment of some different ecosystems that can be in an area. This, for example, is a map of Bailey's sections in the Northern Rockies. And so the way we're using that is we're saying that each of these mapped sections we could define as a landscape for the purposes of classifying ecosystems within it. And how we classify ecosystems in one of these landscapes, like M332G, we would describe and characterize ecosystems within that. If we were also doing work in this neighboring M332A, we would separately describe and classify the ecosystems within that, because even though they might be somewhat similar and described using some of the same types of terms or additional classifications, they will be differing in various ways in terms of such things as their composition and such, because these landscapes do differ in things like climate and so forth. This is an example of using Bailey's, the national hierarchy at the province level in the Great Plains. You can see that these are much larger mappings of areas. The Nature Conservancy has used this kind of level in describing ecoregions, and then further going and looking at various more specific ecosystem processes and types in there. The joint ventures have also tried to use this kind of mapping to define some of their boundaries. So either of these can work. In contrast, looking at the same landscape, these are the major land resource areas as mapped by the Natural Resources Conservation Service in the Great Plains. You can see that that's a finer scale, a finer, smaller mapping of landscapes across the Great Plains. I have found these to be very practical and functional, as I'll explain further. The kinds of information that you can get from the use of these landscapes is very important. So in general, I have found that Bailey's sections work very well when I'm dealing with forested landscapes and trying to do work within those, whereas the NRCS major land resource areas are really the best tool to use in grass and shrubland systems. They aren't as well developed in forested areas. The final one I'll mention is the land fire map zone. Land fire is a whole system that's tried to look at disturbance processes across ecosystems throughout the country, and has tried to come up with a standard process. And it's divided things up a little differently, but there's also associated information that's contained within each of these land fire map zones to describe some ecosystem conditions in those. So it's another good source of information, but the boundaries do vary a little bit from the others. So once you've defined the landscape that you want to work in and set some boundaries on it, then there are two primary drivers of terrestrial ecosystem diversity within those landscapes. The first of those are ecological sites, which can be defined as an area with similar abiotic factors such as climate, soils, aspect, and elevation that allow for the landscape to be divided into different biophysical settings. And there's various processes I'll go into, various tools available to helping to determine that. Across those ecological sites, we then have disturbance processes and successional processes working that determine the specific plant community, in this case for terrestrial systems, that would occur on any given ecological site at a point in time. The ecological sites are fairly fixed features of the landscape, whereas the disturbance that's working across them determines the specific ecosystem that would occur on a specific ecological site at a certain point in time. For example, here on a forested area and mountain country, we can see things like how north and south aspects can influence the kind of plant communities that might be out there. Elevation, higher elevations, moisture, cooler conditions can determine what types of plant communities can be supported there. Topographic features such as valley bottoms can have an influence on all of this. So these are factors that determine how different biophysical settings can occur across the landscape. When we get into shrub and grassland systems, soils are a predominant factor in determining what types of ecosystems, the specific ones that might occur in a location. So having a soils map like this can help us then map out different ecological sites in these locations. So the types of classification systems that are out there, in forested systems, one of them that's heavily used by the Forest Service and other forest agencies include habitat typing. This is Daubenmeier developed this system in Idaho in the 60s. It is a system that describes locations on the ground based on what the plant community that would occur in that site, what it would be at a late successional stage without any disturbance processes in place. And there's basically been guides for these types of systems developed throughout a lot of the West and in the lake states and in some other locations. Typically, these habitat types are then used and combined up into habitat type groups to get a reasonable number of these potential locations that can be mapped across a setting. Landfire, as I've mentioned, has a different system. They define biophysical settings. I'll show you an example of those. And those are described within each of their landfire zones. And then NRCS has its ecological site descriptions, which are useful and in play across. They do a very good job across grass and shrub systems, not as well developed for forestry systems. And there are others in different places, some other types of systems out there, but these are all good examples of how you can take existing information and use it to define ecological sites. So this, for example, is for Region 1 of the Forest Service up in the Northern Rockies for a particular ecoregion. This is one of Bailey's section level ecoregions. And within that, there are identified 9 different habitat type groupings that can be mapped across that landscape. And this is just an example showing how those habitat type groupings can help you understand what the distribution of tree species might be. Some having a fairly wide range of occurrence like lodgepole pine, and others being fairly narrowly restricted to one specific type of those habitat type groupings. These can be mapped in an area. This is an example in the Northern Rockies. This is a project we've worked on. That's the area in red here is our area of interest in this project. It was a southwest crown of the collaborative landscape of about 1.5 million acres. The black lines here in the correspond to these numbers. This is the Bailey's section level, and so this M33, whoops, let me go back. 2B is a second planting, and this M33B East is the third. And so what we're saying is we would define ecosystem diversity a little bit differently in each of those and separate them out. We can use the same habitat type groupings here in all of them, but a cool, moist habitat type grouping up here in this landscape is going to have slightly different ecosystem conditions that will occur here in the adjoining landscape. So that's how the landscaping works and how you can map out ecological sites like this to help characterize the landscape and what's likely to occur there in terms of ecosystem diversity. With NRCS's ecological site systems, they've developed those from their soil maps. So here's an example using one of their MLRAs here in northern Montana and North Dakota. Each of these soils has a different ecological site associated with it, and then a number of different specific ecosystems that can occur across that. So in that way, you can get your landscape defined and ecological sites mapped out. Landfire has these sort of more physical descriptions of biophysical settings that are also mapped out. There's several pages associated with each of these. And so each of these biophysical settings is described in terms of what its vegetation descriptions are, what disturbance processes, and so forth. So another potential source of useful information. Once we've mapped out ecological sites, determined the type of tools and we want to use for identifying those and mapping them, we then want to characterize the disturbance processes that worked historically across these landscapes. There's various sources and tools we can use to do that. Historical documents provide us some information. Sometimes field evaluations, depending on the setting, such things as fire scars. Modeling is often a tool we use. And in some cases, we just have to revert back to the best expert opinion of biologists, forest ecologists, range ecologists, and the like. So for forest systems, what we're trying to look at is what are the successional processes that work in this landscape, and how do those work across these different ecological sites? How are those influenced by diseases and insects, shade tolerance, wind throw, fire, a major factor in many of these systems. In the Southeast, perhaps hurricanes are something we want to factor into our analysis. So we can use things like this, for example, are pictures from 1900 that we could put a specific location around and get a really good feel of what some specific sites look like. This is again in the Northern Rockies example. We can use in some cases fire scar analyses where we have old stumps that we can get what they call a cookie out of and look at when did major fires occur, and when we start looking at, in this case, an example of how we can take those habitat type groupings and look at all of the studies that have been done on different fire return intervals based on fire scar analyses and the like. And from that, we can get a pretty good feel for across within one or different habitat type grouping, what was the predominant types of fire regimes that influenced those systems. A lot of times we'll tie this into modeling activities. At Emory, we've used a model called SIMPPLE quite a bit that allows us to spatially look at and display over time how different plant communities or ecosystems would have occurred under these different disturbance processes across the different ecological sites. And we check this modeling back to make sure that the results we're getting at different points in time is consistent with what we know about the historical disturbance processes that were at work in an area. When we switch to grasslands, slightly different disturbance processes, herbivory becomes one of the big primary drivers of what we look at. Along with fire, we can have drought conditions from weather and such factoring in. And in the prairies, we also have to recognize the role of an ecological engineer, the prairie dog, that can create some unique ecosystems in that kind of system as well. But similarly, we can look at how these disturbance processes worked, and we can then develop, and this is what's been done with NRCS in their ecological site descriptions, what are called state and transition models of all of the different states. In this case, each of these is a historically occurring state in the transitional processes among those. each of these states we would consider an ecosystem that occurred historically on that particular ecological site. The disturbance processes are outlined here. The primary ones in this system we can identify as grazing pressure, so that as we had increased grazing pressure, we would be shifting plant communities from those that had species that were more tolerant of heavier grazing being down here, those species that are more sensitive to grazing pressure being occurring up in this particular ecosystem, and some of the transitions that would occur across there. Whereas the role of fire, if you have a frequent fire regime, you keep the woody vegetation from occurring on this ecological site, so that the big sagebrush that we show out here would not be present with frequent fire, but in places protected from more frequent fire, you would have big sagebrush along with the grass mixes. So in this way, we can describe what the disturbance processes were and the types of specific ecosystems that would have occurred there. The ecological site descriptions from NRCS go further and then also identify some kinds of conditions that can occur outside of those historical conditions. These are some of these conditions now dominated by invasive species, novel ecosystems, and the like, but they allow us to show how things have changed from what was there historically. So using that kind of information, we can then develop specific reference conditions, both at the ecosystem level and at the ecosite level. For example, on that last state and transition model, if we looked at the loamy ecological site that it was in that landscape, and we picked that ecosystem that was characterized by a frequent fire return interval and light grazing, we can characterize all of the dominant species that would be expected to be out there and their relative amounts. And we can also describe what the structure of that system would have been. So this gives us something that we can then use to target. If we wanted to go in and do restoration, we know exactly what kinds of species, both in composition and structure, we're trying to restore to get back that condition that we might want to be restoring. And in this case, this particular ecosystem is one that is very important to a number of our declining wildlife species like sprigs, pipit, and some others that we may want to be trying to do some restoration action to address. We've also used a tool that we term an ecosystem diversity matrix. It simply takes those state and transition models and puts them together across different ecological sites, in this case for
John, it looks like you just froze.
a certain MLRA shown up here. And what this demonstrates here is that, how about now?
Looks like it's going fine now. Maybe turn off your video and see if that helps.
Okay, thanks. So anyway, this is just a tool that we can then be saying these were the historically occurring ecosystems, and then we can start saying what was the distribution of these acreages of these historically, and how does that compare to what's out there today? In forest systems, we use slightly different classifications because, of course, successional processes in forests and things like sizes of trees are driven by both the succession and the disturbance processes in a location. In these systems, we've also tried to apply a canopy cover that we found quite useful, because this really captures, for at least fire prone systems, fire dependent systems of different types, the more open stands that occurred were the result of more frequent fires that often were non-lethal and burned in understories, whereas areas that were protected from more frequent fires would get denser, and when a fire came along, it would be stand replacing and push succession back further. And in between would be more of a mixed fire severity. But same kind of principle here as with the state and transition models for grass and shrub systems, but reflecting the disturbance processes that we were dealing with in fire forest systems. And we can use those to then help, again, describe reference conditions at both the ecosystem and ecosite sort of level. So here, for example, if we had a particular habitat type grouping that might be more moderately warm, dry, with a very large tree size class, we can have either open, moderate, or closed conditions, and we can describe what the reference conditions would be for each of those. So for example, in this case, we could identify the reference conditions of that open canopy disturbance state as being overstory ponderosa pine with smaller amounts of Doug fir and western larch. We can estimate the number of trees of different size classes that would have been out there historically. We can fill in what the coarse woody debris would be found in that site, or number of snags and the like. And again, this gives you the opportunity or the ability to set what your restoration goals would be for a particular site if you're trying to return some of this condition. So with these kinds of tools, what we then look at excuse me, is how have things changed in amounts. So this is a little different display of it, but this would be for a warm, dry ecological site in the Idaho batholith landscape. These are the different disturbance states across here. And we have one listed here, which is a large tree, non-lethal fire maintained state that historically we've determined that a high percentage of that particular ecological site was in that state historically. But today, if we look at these, the green squares, green triangles on here, those are the conditions today. And that what that tells us is that we've seen a significant shift in the amount of this particular ecosystem in that landscape, and it's really lacking today. And so any species dependent upon that are going to have a hard time finding their habitat needs. So we can target this particular condition that we've defined and described what it should be, and start trying to figure out how can we restore those conditions on the landscape. How do we know what's out there today? Existing vegetation can be mapped out in a number of ways. They're going out online. You can find various different existing vegetation maps. Excuse me. National land cover maps. In other locations, we'll have maps of dominant tree species, tree sizes, canopy cover. It varies by location and so forth. Some are national in their coverage, others are more restricted. But we can generally find pretty good information, and we're getting better and better at this all the time with our improvements in remote sensing capabilities. So this, for example, is a map of lesser prairie chicken areas in Oklahoma and Kansas, where we can map out a lot of herbaceous areas and other areas that have gone to cultivated crops. Over here, we're getting into sand sage. And it allows us to then quantify what's out there today. A limitation in grass and shrub systems is that we can't really tell the composition and structure of something that's listed as herbaceous. So some field sampling in these kind of systems is often required if we want to know what is the specific composition and structure of grass or shrub lands in an area. In forest systems, there's a varying amount of information available from existing vegetation maps. This is an area in Alaska where it shows some of it was a national park, and the national park system developed a better remote system classification that allowed it to discern much better the forest systems that were present there. Outside of that, the available information a number of years ago was not as good and was not able to discern specifics as well. But in any given area, you can typically find a pretty good source of existing vegetation mapping. So what I've described here is a process to where we can, first of all, set a landscape boundary. We can identify the ability to map biophysical settings using ecological sites that we can map across the landscape. Within those ecological sites, we define the disturbance processes that worked, that determine what particular mix of ecosystems would be out there at any given point in time and how those transitioned across or among themselves. Then if we went out today and looked at the same thing, we might find that historically this ecosystem B3 was quite predominant in across a certain ecosite in the landscape. And today it's in relatively small amounts. And instead we have a large amount of ecosystem B1. Well, if that ecosystem is not providing that component of the habitat need for these two species, we know that their habitat quality has been decreased substantially. And if we want to improve their habitat, we need to go in and specifically restore these kinds of conditions that are lacking. So given all of that, I think it sets the stage for why we want to do historical restoration. However, we also have to recognize that we have significant challenges to that. Climate change means that a lot of our ecological sites are changing, and the conditions we might be trying to restore will not be sustainable. We have novel ecosystems that we really can't get back to that historical condition feasibly. And we have invasive species issues that must be addressed. What are some examples? For climate change, we can look at something like, this is the distribution of major land resource areas, all of the major land resource areas across South Dakota. And each of these is the current, the historical July temperature across those. This line here displays what we are thinking the July temperature is likely to be with climate change over the next 30 years. And if we don't address climate change, it might be going up to this higher level bar here. Well, what does that mean? Some work by Fisher et al. Predicted that the C4 or warm season grasses that occur in the northern Great Plains are sensitive to that July temperature. Where we have mixed cool season or C3 grasses and warm season C4 grasses, that if the average July temperature is less than 70 degrees, the cool season grasses tend to dominate in those systems and occur there. Whereas when temperatures get above that 70 degrees, the warm season grasses tend to dominate. Why is that significant? Well, the current temperatures that support a mix of that cool and warm season grasses, in the northern mixed grass prairies, the cool season grasses that are there are western wheatgrass, green needlegrass, needle and thread, and others. And those are the grass species that provide good structure, of course, depending on the grazing that's being applied to them. But they have the capability of providing good structure or heights where they're located. As we get further east, we shift more into a northern tall grass ecosystem. And there we have warm season grasses like big and little bluestem and Indian grass that can also provide good grassland structure. But if we're in northern mixed grass ecosystems to the west, where with drier conditions, those warm season grasses that occur there are primarily blue grama, that is a short grass species. So as that temperature goes up, what we're likely to see is the decline in these grasses that have provided the key structure in those systems for many species, and instead be shifting over to blue grama or short grass that won't provide those conditions. So again, species like Sprague's pickpit and others are likely to be declining simply because of this shift in temperature that's occurring. And we can really look at that in detail through this kind of process of understanding at any given location what is likely the composition and structure of plants that should be out there. What should we do about that? Well, first of all, in this case, because we know that the occurrence of those cool season grasses also is influenced by the grazing regimes that we're applying to them, we can start trying to make sure that we provide grazing regimes that allow those cool season grasses that we want to see there to maintain as in highest numbers as we can. We can also start looking, particularly if we get into more of the tall grass system, if we're going to see shifts in species there, we can make sure that we're encouraging those grass species that have similar structure characteristics to those that might be shifting to occur in those locations, so that we might encourage little blue stem to come in to help replace green needlegrass in a location. Whereas if we think we're really going to be changing those communities, we may have to then start looking at how we can shift the locations of those particular ecosystems to neighboring landscapes, which means trying to identify and maintain linkage zones of similar types of ecological sites and conditions to allow movements of species across these. In forest systems, we can do similar kinds of things that look at how community conditions across biophysical settings, in this case, maybe habitat type groupings. We might have a habitat type grouping that is at a lower elevation, a warm, dry habitat type, whereas a little bit higher or on a different aspect, we might have a warm, moist habitat type. We might project that warm, moist habitat type is likely to take on more characteristics of a warm, dry habitat type, and start planning to shift the distribution of the species that are occurring there to more of that will be defensible or sustainable rather into the future. Further, we can look at in forest systems how climate change is affecting fire regimes and try to protect stands that have large trees that typically would have withstood fire in the past and find ways to better protect them in the future from stand replacing fire. Invasive species, we can be looking at trying to suppress those in key locations. Some of these actions are pretty intensive to get that work done. It can be things like chemical control if we're looking at cheatgrass and that's invaded grassland and sagebrush systems and totally changed the dynamics of those. With the introduction of those, they change the fire regimes. We might have to be looking at placing fire breaks to keep areas from being totally taken over by cheatgrass and more frequent fire regimes. And even more intensively, we might have to go in and look at sagebrush and native grass planting, all quite expensive and difficult processes, but ones that can be done to try and address invasive species in key areas. Similarly with tame grass invasions, things like Kentucky bluegrass, there are ways we can look to shift those back to more net grazing, fire, and chemical control. All of these do tend to be fairly intensive in their application. Novel ecosystems present even additional challenges in that these are conditions that are produced that may be extremely difficult, if not impossible, to reverse. So in some cases, we just have to accept the fact that we have to maintain some of these novel ecosystems in various locations. In these cases, we should look at them and try and select management practices that allow us to try and compensate for the characteristics that we think are important to that particular location to be maintained. A quote by Miller and Bestelmeyer on novel ecosystems was that Irreversible thresholds have been acknowledged in restoration for years, but predicting when a threshold will be crossed and the degree of reversibility is problematic. Oftentimes, reversibility is a function of multiple factors such as cost and public support. In this sense, a novel ecosystem is not an alternate state, but a decision. So sort of in closing on that, one other thought is that because of all of some of these challenges that we have there, some of the efforts at restoration are going to need to be quite intensive and quite costly. Because of that, we may not be able to just go out and spread our restoration efforts broadly across landscapes where it might be desirable to have them occur. This is an example of, for lesser prairie chickens, this is the overall range of the lesser prairie chicken. This is down in New Mexico and Texas, and this is Kansas, Colorado, and Oklahoma. And we know that this species that's due to be listed by the Fish and Wildlife Service this month is in significant decline, and we need to do restoration around it. However, the available funding to do restoration is somewhat limited. And if we take that funding and we spread it out across this whole area, we end up with what we have termed random acts of conservation that are all good intended efforts, but they just don't produce the big blocks of high quality habitat we need. So rather, what we might want to do is to try to concentrate our restoration efforts on specifically located areas that have the best probabilities of providing continuing habitat into the future, whether those are 25 to 50,000 acres or whatever, and we can identify where those locations are, set our restoration goals specifically in those to try to create those kind of conditions that lesser prairie chickens need to persist. So in summary, what I've tried to provide here is that restoration really is an essential action if we want to maintain biodiversity and the habitat for each and all of our native species. I hope I've provided enough of a background to present that we have the tools and information to characterize and conduct restoration in most locations across North America. Restoring historical conditions, though, is off ecosystems and invasion by exotic species. So just because we've set a historical reference, that is not necessarily what we want to restore in a particular location because of these challenges. But I think it's critical that we have the information so we know what has changed so we can make the best informed decisions as we go forward. And with that, can try to answer any questions that anybody may have.
Thank you for the great presentation, John. I remind everyone there's a Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in there. I like your presentation, John. You presented some great tools for planning for restoration, really, to make sure efforts are effective. Let's see the questions we have. We have a raised hand. Let's see if I can put those people on. I'm assuming these people want to ask their question.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah. Ask your question, please, Michelle.
Yeah, I'm curious if it's your point about looking to other more, let's say, durable vegetative species that might do better in a changed climate going forward. Perhaps it's a drier, rather, as you said, rather than a moist type of prairie vegetation, maybe it's a drier prairie type of vegetation. And I'm just curious, do you know if there is a source, for those of us who are not botanists, is there a source out there where if you have certain plant species that you've been working with a number of years, which are native, which you know work for this particular habitat or this particular species, that are good replacements for those in a climate changed world? Are you aware of any of a source location? Because that's one of my struggles, is I hear this a lot about looking at more durable vegetation mixes, but I don't have a knowledge of what's good replacements for what's there or what we've been using.
Yeah, well, take it, for example, in grasslands, one thing you might be able to do is if you're in a certain MLRA and a major land resource area, and you're in a, say, described conditions for a 10 to 14 inch precipitation zone, if you know it's going to be going drier, you might be looking then at an 8 to 12 inch future precipitation zone, and you could look at the species composition for a particular ecological site in that particular zone, and it would tell you that here are your more drier site conditions that would correspond to that same soil class and so forth, and you could pick some of those out as replacement species. Or the reverse, if you're going to have more moisture, then you can look at what new species you might introduce to the area that would do better with greater moisture.
Okay, and are those plant species mixed by those precipitation levels? Are those easily readable, like on NRCS, or like where would you point somebody to get that information the quickest, the most?
NRCS has on their internet system, through their what they call their Surgo system, the descriptions of all of these ecological sites that go into great detail and say the amounts of each type of plant under certain conditions. And so if you just simply compared an ecological site in a 10 to 14 inch precip zone to an ecological site on a similar loamy soil on a 8 to 10 inch zone, you would get a very good comparison of the difference in the species that would be supported across those two sites.
Okay. And then I imagine it's rather than a complete replacement, because the climate change is gradual. You would mix in. You would begin to mix in rather than a complete replacement.
Exactly. You either you could either go in if you had the ability to really get aggressive, you could go in and do some pretty intensive planting and all, but otherwise you could do it at a lighter rate and just start to try and get that kind of transition going.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks for the question, Michelle. We can go in the chat now. Somebody's asking if it'll be possible to get a copy of the slides. You don't have to answer now, John. We don't want to put you on the spot, but we can discuss this later, and we'll find a way to get it to you. Somebody's asking if there are equivalent organizations in Canada. Do you know, John, if there's equivalent work?
I'm not as familiar of all of what's going on in Canada. You might know better than me, Julian, of similar kinds of work. I know this, for example, a lot of model forest work that's been done in Canada on forest systems that have done similar kinds of approaches. So I think that'd be a place I would start looking at up there, whether that's been done by provincial governments or just specific model forests, but that's one place to look up there. I'm not as familiar with some of the grassland work that maybe's gone on up in Canada.
Yeah, we have some resources from the different provincial governments in Canada. It's not quite the same as the work you're doing. I would say your work seems more complete in terms of history of the ecosystems and succession and things like that. But yeah, check it out for British Columbia. There's the Biogeoclimatic Ecosystem Classification. Alberta has the BMI, the Biological Monitoring Institute. I know Quebec had an ecosystem classification system, and I think all provinces do. It's usually sort of focused on forestry practices. Somebody else asking a question. Could you give an example of a decision tool for analyses of where to target efforts?
Could you repeat that one, Julian? I'm looking for it here.
The person is looking for a decision tool for analyses that would help to target efforts. I feel like what you presented is a great decision tool.
Yeah, I mean, it's there's all of these tools that that help you get to that decision. I don't know of any one decision tool, but it's a combination of developing the information and then making that informed decision about where and how to do your or concentrate your restoration work.
Yeah, and I'm assuming in terms of decision making, there could be sort of an extension to your work, but that might not be in place. Somebody's asking a similar question than previously, if there are tools like that for places outside North America. I'm not sure if we have that knowledge. There's I'm just thinking now though for predicting sort of the effect of climate change. There's a tool that I use sometimes. It's called +2C, and it models how the climate is projected to be in different scenarios in the future, and it's very useful for planning. So it'll tell you, for example, that this place on Vancouver Island in 30 years will be equivalent to another place in Oregon in terms of climate. Just sharing that. Lots of people love the presentation. Somebody here interested in a follow-up webinar on different techniques for different ecosystems? That's a good thing that the working group could do for you.
What was that, Julian?
To sort of flesh out specific techniques for different ecosystems. So, there's a lot to explore there.
Yeah, I didn't quite catch that whole question.
It was more of a comment, sorry.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I see quite a number of questions listed in here. I'm not sure if Tricia, if there's a way to follow up. Good, I can get you the questions after the webinar and you can answer and provide a PDF on the webinar. Yeah, the PDF I can provide a lot of, it's a really big file because of the maps and things in it. But certainly the text is easy to provide. It may have to be stripped out of some of the maps, unfortunately, but could certainly be glad to provide that.
Okay, so yeah, John will try to follow up as much as possible. We're out of time. Sorry for those who couldn't have their questions answered. And thank you for attending, everyone.
Great. Yep. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate the opportunity.
Thanks, John, for presenting.